All right, so part 2 of 5.2 is going to focus on reinforcement scheduling. I didn't want to take up too much time because I figured I could spend a little bit more time and details on this because this is also kind of tricky for students, I have found. So we're going to talk about fixed ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval schedules of reinforcement. So we've talked about reinforcement and punishment so far in operant conditioning. Recall that punishment is not quite as effective as reinforcement in shaping behaviors and considering and encouraging people to behave or animals to behave a certain way. So reinforcement schedules are how you plan out your reinforcements, plan out your rewards for people behaving in the way that you want them to, or your animals doing what you want them to. So your options here are between everyone is going to be either fixed or variable. Okay, meaning that it is going to be fixed, consistent, not all over the place, or variable in that it's kind of a random amount of times in after which they get it. So fixed is that it's consistent reward, variable is that it's more random reward. And then ratio and interval, those two, ratio deals with number of responses, whereas interval is amount of time. Okay, so ratio is the number of responses, the number of times that you do something. Interval is the amount of time between your responses. So let's talk about each one of these. A fixed ratio reinforcement schedule. An example of this would be like your buy 10 Starbucks coffees, and then on your 10th time, your next one's free. Okay, you get a freebie. So a punch card would be fixed ratio. Okay, so it will be fixed because it's every 10 times, and it's ratio because it's not an amount of time. It's not like one free coffee per month. It's one free coffee every time you buy 10 cups of coffee. Right? So it's fixed amount of time. Ratio, it's based on the amount of responses that you have or the number of times that you do the action that they're shaping. They want to shape you to buy more coffee. So these punch cards are a way to do that. It's meant to encourage you to buy more coffee. They tell you that it's a reward, but really it's a way to encourage you to buy more coffee. So your reinforcement is every 10th cup of coffee, you get a new one. So punch cards are a great example of a fixed ratio. Every 10 responses or 10 cups of coffee you buy, 10 behaviors that they want, you get your reinforcement, a free cup of coffee. Okay. So what this does is this gets a high response rate, but it gets a brief drop off after reinforcement because right? So think about like when you're really close to that, when you're at that 7, 8, or 9 cups of coffee, you're probably thinking about it more. You know that you're about to get your reinforcement, your free cup. And so you're more likely to go back and buy more coffee those last couple times than you are right after you get the reward. You're like, oh, I'm not going to think about this. It's a long way away. Okay. Second one is variable ratio. And this one is very potent. It's a reinforcer after a random number of responses. So it's variable. It's random when you get that, but you are going to get it. But it's going to be based on how many times you do something, right? So let's think about the most famous example of variable ratio reinforcement is gambling. This is one of the ways it's so potent, is that it's on this variable ratio form of reinforcement. Think about gambling. When you're playing slots, right? When you're playing slots, you're going to get a reinforcement every now and then, right? There are days that you'll sit there and you'll pull the lever 100 times and may not win much, but the odds are you'll probably win something eventually. Okay, sometimes you'll win things more frequently. You know that every time you have a chance of winning. You don't know, well, every 10th time I pull, I'll get a reward. No, every time you think you have a chance of winning, but it's random. It could be 10 times between you get a reward, 2 times, or 100 times before you get that reinforcement reward of flashing lights, exciting, money coming out, like all of those things. So it's unpredictable. This gets really high response rates, and it's really hard to break this. Addiction is often a form of it. It comes from these variable ratio forms of reinforcement, right? People get a gambling addiction because of this. You think, well, I can win next time. I can win next time. I can win next time. Variable ratio reinforcement is probably the most potent form of reinforcement. Next would be fixed interval. So again, this is fixed. It's the same amount of time in between, and it's interval, so it's based on time, not the amount of responses. So It may be fixed interval, maybe every 5 minutes a reward is available. Okay. So an example would be a paycheck. Every month, if you do your work, then you will get a reward, right? A quiz on Friday, I think, is an even better example, right? If we have a quiz every single Friday, you know that you're getting that form of, reward. We'll call it a reward. That's the reinforcement. And what's it reinforcing? It's reinforcing studying, right? It's reinforcing you're actually going over the materials. But if you have a quiz every Friday, when do you study? Do you study every single day? No. You study Thursday night, probably, and you cram all the material in. So fixed interval means that you begin to anticipate when that reinforcement is coming, right? The quiz. You anticipate when your reward is coming, and so you're more likely to put in work right before then and really increase your response rate around that time instead of consistently. Right. So let's think about, if we're talking about quizzes instead, doing a variable ratio reinforcement schedule for quizzes. That means you're going to have quizzes. But you don't know when they are. They're random. They could pop up at any time. Maybe I'll have a quiz in back-to-back days. Maybe I don't have a quiz for 10 days, but you don't know. And so you're more likely to be studying every single day than if it's fixed interval, which is, it's on Friday. So you probably aren't doing much Monday through Wednesday, but on Thursday night you'll study. That's fixed interval. If it's variable, you don't know when it's going to pop up. And then variable interval reinforces first response after varying times. So again, this one's variable. Okay, so it's random, and then it's interval, so it's based on an amount of time. So as I said, sorry, I misspoke earlier and talked about pop quizzes as variable ratio. They are actually variable interval, right? It's not the amount of times you come to class. It's just a random times between class periods. It doesn't matter what you do or how much you study, that quiz is still going to happen. So that's variable interval. It's reinforce your first response after varying time intervals. It's unpredictable, right? Checking your email. You don't know if you're going to find anything, right? But like that email is going to come in at a random amount of time. Just checking your phone isn't going to make that new notification appear or that new thing pop up, but you sit there and refresh it because maybe that thing that you want is there, right? You refreshing Instagram is not going to make someone message you every couple times you swipe down. But if you sit there and swipe long enough, you know that probably eventually, after amount of time, after someone does message you, it will pop back. So you don't really know when. This is also low, but you get steady response rates. So the basically big idea is that you get a higher response rate when you're on ratio schedules. Okay, so you're going to get a lot more responses on these because it's based on how many times you do something and not based on time. If you do something more, you're more likely to have, so in gambling, right? If you pull the lever more, you're more likely to get a reward. If you pull the lever once and wait an hour and pull the lever again, you have a much lower chance of winning than if you pull the lever 100 times during that hour, right? If gambling was variable interval, then all you would do is show up and pull the lever and you'd leave it alone for a couple hours and come back and pull it again. It wouldn't work. Ratio means it's based on you. So it's very potent, a higher response rate. Whereas more consistent responses come with variable schedules. Okay. So variable schedules give you pretty consistent responses, which is why variable ratio is so potent. You get consistent responses because people don't know when the reward is coming, right? And it's also potent because you get more responses. Okay, so this is kind of what that looks like if you're on any reinforcement schedule. Start at fixed ratio. If you have a fixed ratio, you notice that you get a ton of responses because the pigeon learns, or the humans learn, that the more they do something, the more they get something. Right? They learn that every 20 times I peck this disc, I get some food. And so we see a very small drop off right after they get their reward. It means that they basically ramp up and get more and more excited as they're getting closer to the time, but then a small drop off, but more or less they're pretty consistent in how they're doing things. But what we also see with fixed ratio is that if you stop giving that reward, it drops off really quickly. This only works if you are really doing it consistently. If you lose that fixed nature, they begin to drop off, right? It drops off quickly. Okay. But variable ratio, in contrast, if you're always doing variable ratio, you're still getting a lot of responses, but you tend to get a little bit more consistent responses, right? You tend to get more and more consistent responses over time because of that variable nature, right? You have longer stretches where they're doing it, they just kind of pace themselves out. Switch to a fixed interval, and you notice that there's lots and lots of responses closer to, or like a punch card. Right after you get your free reward, you're not as likely to go. You're not thinking about it. When you know you see that punch card's at 5 or 6, you're like, ooh, I got to come get coffee more because I'm about to get a free one. And you ramp up how much you do. And then you again die off and ramp up and die off and ramp up. Okay. Variable interval, you pretty much get a kind of steady response, but it's slow, right? You don't get a lot of responses on these. So on intervals, not nearly as many responses, but we get more steady on variable ones. Okay. There are some limits on operant conditioning you should know, and is that a lot of it's limited by nature. It's really difficult to train animals to do something that they don't want to do. Same thing with humans. So for instance, for a pigeon, if you were trying to train it to flap its wings to avoid being shocked, it's going to do that really naturally. But if you're training it to peck a disc, it's even harder, right? It's really trickier to do that because that's not a natural thing for it to do. The more unnatural something is, the harder it is to make it happen, right? So we reflect our kind of natural predispositions in that. So by now, you should have a decent understanding of the differences between classical and operant conditioning. If you don't, go back and watch these again. Go and do the practice. Really make sure you get those down. We'll go over those when we come back from break. And for now, make sure you got these. I will see y'all in class.